This place has earned its place in history, not just through the stone it was built with, but through the strategic advantage its location gave to Rome. Perched on a rugged, rocky promontory 254 meters above sea level, commanding the entire Eskdale Valley below, this is Hardknott Roman Fort. On a clear, dry day, you can stand here and make out the Irish Sea in the distance, and on the horizon, the faint silhouette of the Isle of Man. You might think that's simply a beautiful view. But for Rome, this wasn't about scenery. And what made this fort powerful wasn't the walls or the stone. For Rome, this place functioned as the eye of a system. Because on a frontier, power rarely comes from striking first. It comes from seeing first. Known in antiquity as Mediobogdum, it was built in the early years of Hadrian's reign, between 120 and 130 AD, in the rugged highlands of the Lake District, in the northwest corner of Roman Britain. And it was built here for a reason. What I want to show you is this. By combining archaeological evidence with AI visualization tools, we can reconstruct what life actually looked like on that windswept ridge above Eskdale. How people lived, how the system worked. That's why we're here. From the moment Hardknott was constructed, its solid design helped Rome maintain control over something essential. Not territory, but flow. Rome's real concern was channeling movement into predictable routes, making crossings countable and traceable, and ensuring that this didn't work just for a day, but became routine. A manageable system. That's why Hardknott wasn't simply an isolated outpost at the edge of the empire. It was one piece of a multi-layered frontier order, working alongside Hadrian's Wall, coastal defenses, and an inland control network. A quick note before we go further, the reconstructions you'll see in this video are not definitive. They're built from what remains, ruins, inscriptions, and architectural patterns found at Roman military sites across the empire. So, as you watch, I'd encourage you to ask not, what did this place look like? But rather, how did it work? Because Roman frontiers didn't survive through stone and mortar. They survived through systems, the same patrols, the same reports, the same checkpoints, day after day. Today, when we look at this skeleton of a fort clinging to a windswept hilltop, something immediately stands out: the shape. Classic Roman symmetry, rounded corners, a perfectly proportioned rectangular plan that resembles an oversized playing card. Inside the walls, there's a garrison space of 1.1 hectares. Add the outer ditches, and you're looking at 1.3 hectares of living and defensive space, carved into the top of a wild mountain. The buildings inside weren't protected by a simple fence. They were shielded by walls roughly 1.7 meters thick, built from local stone torn directly out of these mountains. Those same walls were partially re-raised to over 2 meters in height during 1950s restoration, and you can walk in their shadow today. But Rome's engineering genius didn't stop at the walls. The real secret was in the earth itself. 2 massive ditches were cut into the hillside, specifically on the uphill face of the fort, the side most exposed to attack. Rome wasn't just building a stone fortress here, it was turning the landscape into a weapon, using topography to create a defensive network stronger than any wall alone. The factors that made Hardknott truly significant were built into the very design of this place. The military road recorded in the Antonine itinerary as Iter X provided both the strategic motivation and the daily purpose of the fort. Look closely at that thin line on the map. It begins in the southwest, rises from the restless waves of the Irish Sea, and climbs through deep valleys into the mountains, connecting the interior of Britain to the wider Roman road network in the south. It passed through Hardknott's brutal terrain, reaching an elevation of 393 meters at the summit of the pass, making it one of the highest Roman roads in all of Britain. This wasn't just a mountain crossing, it was the most demanding stretch of the vital artery linking the Irish seacoast to the British interior. In Roman logic, when a pass was uncontrolled, the frontier weakened, and the repeated surveillance cycles that gave Hardknott its power began to break down. But when the passes were regulated, power was restored. The border became visible. During construction, 4 main gates were built into the fort: south, east, west, and finally north. The north gate was designed with a single narrow passage overlooking a sheared drop. That's no accident. It was a calculated trap, funneling a potential attacker into a tight, lethal choke point. These gates weren't just entry and exit points, they were focal nodes where movement was recorded, arrivals were counted, identities were checked, and people were held or cleared as needed. The system always knew the answers to 3 questions: who enters, where do they go, and how closely can they be tracked? This was more than a fort built from stone. It was a system combining surveillance and administrative control into a single structure. The true power of Rome's frontier rarely came from battles. It came from something far quieter: prevention, resolving potential conflicts before they escalated. On most days at Hardknott, nothing happened. A few officers rotated shifts, reports were filled out, travelers were observed, some were detained briefly, others were waved through. But surveillance was always high, and that visibility was the point. Roman soldiers watched the landscape carefully, and everyone in the surrounding area saw Rome's presence every single day. Presence repeated becomes part of daily routine, and that was Roman policy. At the heart of the fort stood the headquarters building, a central courtyard flanked by offices, a hall where orders were read aloud, and at the rear, the treasury and imperial shrine. Adjacent to it stood the praetorium, the commanding officer's residence. Together, these 2 buildings tell us something important. This wasn't simply a place where soldiers stood watch. It was a place where administration, bureaucracy, and discipline were woven into the fabric of daily life. Roman frontiers weren't held by soldiers alone. They were held by records, schedules, and discipline. A frontier can only function as long as it's properly supplied, and supplying this place was enormously difficult. Seen from above, one of the most striking structures is the pair of granaries positioned side by side. Their walls are thick, built to carry a heavy roof. They're reinforced with large external buttresses. Inside, stone pillars raise the wooden floor off the ground, preventing grain from rotting in Cumbria's notoriously damp climate. Think about what it took to fill those granaries. Every sack of grain, every barrel of olive oil first arrived by sea, then crossed mountain passes by pack animal before finally reaching this door. If the grain spoiled, it wasn't just a supply problem, it was a system failure. The fact that supplies came all the way from Ambleside makes this even more concrete. The entire operation depended on one question: is the road open? Is the pass crossable? Hardknott's role in controlling Iter X served its own logistical survival. Beyond the walls, there was one more structure that spoke to everyday life: the bathhouse. Built just outside the south gate, it was heated by a hypercaust system beneath the floor. It had warm rooms, a cold plunge, a hot bath, and a steam room. That might sound like a luxury, but when you think about frontier psychology, it becomes something else entirely. These soldiers spent their days in cold wind, relentless rain, isolated patrols, and enforced monotony. Morale was always at risk. The bathhouse was built precisely because the system couldn't afford for it to collapse. A brief note worth keeping: the bath was where both body and spirit were repaired. Even at the furthest edge of the empire, Rome made sure its soldiers lived within Roman order, because discipline, morale, and health were all part of control. But the most extraordinary detail at Hardknott isn't inside the walls at all. It's about 200 meters to the east. When you step outside the fort and look across that harsh slope, you see something that looks almost impossible: a vast, perfectly leveled parade ground. roughly 140 by 80 meters, 1.2 hectares of flat, open space. Think about what it took to create that. Soldiers already exhausted from patrol duty in freezing conditions, manually hauling tons of mud and rock to level a boggy hillside, just to have flat ground. Around 5,000 cubic meters of excavation and fill. It's genuinely hard to believe. Why would they do this? Because Rome required discipline to be performed, publicly, visibly, even at the most isolated posting on the map. Order had to be seen, not just practiced. But a system isn't kept alive by stone and ceremony alone. It's kept alive by people, and the traces they leave behind are more vivid than you might expect. The waterlogged, acidic soil of this site acted like a dark archive, freezing time. In 1965, a fragment of a leather jerkin was recovered beside the granaries. By 1968, multiple military boots and leather goods had been brought to light. These aren't simply finds, they're small witnesses to how life actually moved inside a garrison. What we learn from them is rarely found in the sharpness of a sword. It's found in how many more steps a worn-out boot sole could still carry. On rocky, steep terrain like this, hobnailed sandals wore down fast, and the deep repair marks visible on those recovered soles speak quietly but clearly. Supplies didn't always arrive on time. Mountain passes and road conditions kept the logistics permanently fragile. But soldiers couldn't wait. If a sole gave out, the patrol faltered. If the patrol faltered, the system's rhythm broke. Repair wasn't optional here, it was the system itself. The work was done inside the fort. Available material was reused. Worn pieces were stitched back together. That is the rawest, most visible truth of frontier life. To understand Hardknott, you shouldn't look for great events. Look for a boot being repaired for the third time and stitched again. Taken together, everything here, the walls, the gates, the bathhouse, the granaries, points to something beyond mere survival. The purpose wasn't to exist, it was to sustain. The rhythm of a frontier is built not from the shape of stone, but from the daily routine inside it. And Hardknott's story isn't a still image, it breathes, expanding and contracting with imperial strategy, rising in importance and fading into the background as priorities shifted. Its timeline makes that fluctuation clear and reminds us of something fundamental. A frontier is always the result of a decision. The first intensive occupation falls under Hadrian, 120 to 138 AD. This is the phase when the fort slots fully into the system. Road control, pass security, coast to interior connectivity, all working as a single unit. Then Antoninus Pius pushes north. Troops shift to the new line, and Hardknott is abandoned between roughly 138 and 160 AD. This abandonment isn't failure, it's a shift in imperial priority. When Rome moved the line northward, this node became temporarily unnecessary. The archaeology whispers something almost melancholy. Order didn't end abruptly here, it quietly relocated. But the Antonine Wall experiment was short-lived. Under Marcus Aurelius, there's a withdrawal, and Hardknott comes back to life, around 160 to 197 AD. That return proves exactly why this location was chosen in the first place. When strategic pressure shifted, the fort guarding the mountain passes regained its value. A place that gets abandoned and then retaken is a place that genuinely serves a system. Then crisis struck at the imperial center, and the frontier felt it immediately. In 197 AD, the governor of Britain, Clodius Albinus, took his army to the continent to fight a civil war, leaving the island exposed. The Maeotai and Caledoni poured into the vacuum. A wave of destruction followed. Excavations at Hardknott reveal a clear fire and destruction layer from this period. Here, the true fragility of the frontier is laid bare. Even the strongest stone becomes vulnerable when the people and the order sustaining it are withdrawn. When the system collapsed, the attack didn't just come through the gate, it came for the routine itself. Under Septimius Severus, in the early 200s, hands returned to the stone, but only for partial repairs. The fort's importance gradually diminished. This wasn't a story that ended all at once. It was more like a weight slowly withdrawn. The road still existed, the stone still stood, but this place was no longer at the center of the network. Even so, evidence suggests the ruins served as a temporary shelter through the 4th century. And that completes the final sentence of Hardknott's timeline. What matters here is that a frontier's history isn't just written in construction and abandonment. It's written in the same stone being given different purposes across different eras. As imperial strategy changed, so did the meaning of this place. And that change is carved into the lifespan of the stone itself. So who actually served here? The inscriptions are clear. Cohors 4 Delmatarum, the 4th Dalmatian cohort. Not legionaries, but auxiliaries, men from the Adriatic coast of the Balkans, Dalmatian infantry. That choice was not random. Rome's frontier logic included matching the right people to the right terrain. A mountainous landscape demanded soldiers accustomed to mountain conditions. And why auxiliaries rather than legionaries? Because Rome held its frontiers not through identity, but through adaptability and continuity. Hardy auxiliaries who knew rough terrain kept the system running without interruption. The empire placed its most demanding assignments in the hands of people who weren't Roman by birth, but who had invested in Roman order. For auxiliary soldiers, there was a promise on the horizon. After roughly 25 years of service, citizenship. That promise was the thread that tied them to Rome's hardest postings. Hardknott stones endured, but so did this human mechanism. Both held the empire's edge in place. There's one more detail that speaks to the harshness of this posting: the absence of a vicus. Around most Roman forts, a civilian settlement grew up. Merchants, families, craftspeople. At Hardknott, there's not a single trace of a permanent vicus or cemetery. The reason isn't hard to understand. Steep roads, violent weather, acidic soil hostile to farming. This was not a place civilian life chose to put down roots. That absence is like a footprint on the map. The fort is clearly there, but it left no lasting ring of life around it. Yet late Roman coins and traces of fire show that the ruins still provided occasional shelter for those passing through. Hardknott was both a functioning node in a living system, and, when that system weakened, a shell that became a refuge. Everything we've covered can't be explained by a simple inside-the-wall versus outside-the-wall division. What Hardknott held wasn't just a line against barbarians. It was a road through the mountains, a supply chain from the coast, logistics extending into the interior, and possibly the protection of valuable resource flows. Archaeological evidence connects this road to the exploitation of local minerals, lead, silver, and iron around Eskdale and Boot, traces of ironworking near Ravenglass. At this point, Hardknott's role becomes even clearer. Road security wasn't only about military movement. It meant protecting the economic arteries running between the coast and the interior. Rome's frontier system was almost always, simultaneously, both a security system and an economic one. When you bring all these pieces together, Hardknott's story doesn't fit into a single sentence. Every element, the high promontory, the commanding view down the valley, the possibility of optical signaling, the road climbing toward the pass, movement funneled through the gates, the headquarters, the granaries, the bathhouse, the parade ground. All of it stitches together around a single idea: control. Control designed in partnership with nature, not in spite of it. And over all of this, a historical cycle that opened and closed with the empire's shifting strategies. What we have today is a fragment: walls, ditches, a ground plan, a few restored sections. But that fragment still asks the same questions. How do you control a frontier? How do you make power visible? How do you turn surveillance into routine? Rome's answer is buried in places like Hardknott. And the detail that must not be missed is this: Behind the stone, there isn't just a wall. There's a system embedded in the stone itself. On most days, nothing happened. A patrol walked its circuit. A gate opened and closed. The granary stayed dry. The bathhouse warmed up. A report was written, and the frontier held, precisely on the days when nothing happened at all.